Hi, welcome back to Future Path. And for those of you who are here for the first time, you are into the middle of the conversation with a very interesting person, Aubrey. And I really urge you to not miss the first part of our conversation because you will find a continuity to what we're going to talk about it. But nevertheless, if you are here, enjoy this and you will find the reason why you should go back and get the first part of our conversation. With that, Aubrey, thank you once again to stay on with us in this conversation. So, can you please uh, tell us one with the name longevity escape velocity?
Okay, so this is a term that I coined nearly 20 years ago. And it arose from thinking about the longer term consequences of the ideas that I had been putting forward over the previous few years, so between basically 2000 and 2003, something like that, regarding how we might develop medicines to postpone the health problems of late life. The big realization that I had had, a kind of a eureka moment, was in the summer of 2000 when I realized that it was going to be considerably easier to postpone the health problems of late life by reversing aging than by slowing it down, which is very counterintuitive, really. Think of aging as a kind of juggernaut. Obviously, surely it's going to be easier to slow it down than to put it into reverse. But I realized that that was actually not correct, and that an approach which essentially revolves around damage repair, on eliminating the various types of damage that the body does to itself throughout life, this would be the simplest way to go. And of course, I had also fleshed this out in terms of specifics. I had enumerated 7 major categories of damage that the body does to itself and 7 corresponding damage repair approaches that could plausibly be developed to eliminate that damage and thereby rejuvenate the body. Um, but of course, I also realized that these approaches for damage repair would be imperfect. They would only work to a certain extent. And of course, we would try to improve that quality, that efficacy as much as possible. But initially, we would only have modest impact. So I started to think about what that meant in terms of how long people could expect to live. And I realized that there would come a point where the overall efficacy, effectiveness of the panel of damage repair interventions that we would develop might be able to give people an extra maybe 20 years of healthy life. And, that's obviously great in and of itself. But because these therapies would not be perfect, there would be things that there would be difficult damage that they wouldn't actually work on. People would still, after those additional 20 years of healthy life, they would still go downhill the same way that we do now and eventually die. Fine, well, better than nothing, I thought. But then I realized that we could go a bit further than that, because 20 years is a really, really long time in technology. In particular, it's a long time in medical technology. So that if we consider what this means, we'll be treating people who are already in middle age at the time we develop the therapies, right? They're already, let's say, 60, because it's damage repair. You don't have damage when you're young, right? So let's say they're 60 and we do this stuff to them so that they're not biologically 60 for the second time until they are 80. That's the 20 years that I mentioned. Thing is, in those 20 years, we are going to improve the therapies. And so we're going to be able to give the same people, the 80-year-olds, damage repair 2.0, that will genuinely, not only repair the easy damage that 1.0 was able to repair, but also some of the difficult damage. So probably not all of it, but some of it, which means we'll be actually able to re-rejuvenate the same people, when they're 80, so that they won't be biologically 60 for the third time until they're 100 or 120 or whatever. And of course, the same will continue to happen. So the term longevity escape velocity is what I coined and what I defined as the minimum rate at which scientists will be required to improve the comprehensiveness of these damage repair therapies so that people will be in the position I just described. They'll be able to stay one step ahead of the problem, however long they live, just by getting the state-of-the-art therapy at any particular age. So that's the idea. And the reason I named my new foundation after this was because it's a concept whose time has really come. 20 years ago, when I started my first foundation, the Methuselah Foundation, along with a wonderful businessman named Dave Goebel, things were not really understood. Rejuvenation wasn't understood. I had only come out with the whole damage repair concept 3 years earlier. And even 6 years after that, in 2009, when I started Sense Research Foundation, then, most people kind of got the idea. And but there was still a huge amount to do to develop particular damage repair technologies against particular types of damage, and that's what we focused on. But now we're in a position to take another step forward because everybody gets rejuvenation now. Pretty much, it's the mainstream thing, and yet people really don't get the concept of longevity escape velocity, which is the kind of logical conclusion that one cannot escape, one inevitably reaches when one considers rejuvenation that's even fairly comprehensive.
Right, and obviously there are a lot of people who talk about uh, slowing down the aging. So you clearly identify yourself as a different group, and there are some people who talk about defeating death. So, how do you identify yourself with that? And particularly the transhumanist group. In fact, some of them actually regard you very highly for the kind of work you're doing. But at the same time, they talk about extending life to, why not 1,000 years? Taking from that book Ray Kurzweil wrote almost 14, 15 years ago. So, where do you see yourself in this spectrum?
Yeah, I don't really think of myself as a transhumanist. You're absolutely right. The transhumanist movement regards me as one of its own. But for me, I'm just a medical researcher. I'm just interested in helping people not to get sick. And honestly, I think the word transhumanism does more harm than good to transhumanists. That really, the essence of transhumanism is simply to celebrate the potential of future technologies to improve the human condition of one sort or another, and not to be short-sighted about the extent to which that can be done. And I'm all over that, that's fine. But the word sounds scary to people, and I don't think it really is the right word to use. I'm a first things first kind of guy. I'm just a medical researcher. I don't think about defeating death either. Longevity is a side effect of health, right? Because, at the end of the day, most people die from being sick, right? These days. And of course, most people get sick as a result of having been born a long time ago. So that's why aging causes the largest amount of suffering as well as the largest amount of death worldwide. But I don't think of death per se as the enemy. I think of sickness per se as the enemy.
Well, I think that marks a significant difference from a thought process of transhumanism. Right.
Yeah, I
Aubrey,
don't even know. You see, I don't actually know that that's true. I think what a lot of transhumanists do like to do is to capitalize on, if you like, shock value, to parade the fact that there is no inherent limit to how far we can postpone the health problems of late life and thus postpone death. They like to point that out. And I have certainly done that myself. I certainly am quite, unashamed to say that I think it's now fairly likely that most people alive today will live to 1,000 unless we annihilate ourselves with nuclear war or, get hit by an asteroid or whatever. But that's not something I think about. It's just the logical conclusion of where I think the work is going and how rapidly.
well, I guess that is exactly why probably they like to see you as part of their community in that sense. So, Aubrey, how do you explain the relevance of LEV? I like this longevity. Escape velocity is something I perhaps like more than the longevity part. But how do you explain the relevance of it in the current context of one post-COVID world that we even saw globally. The lifespan actually had a dip even in US, and also that recently the global population crossed 8 billion.
Yeah, I don't really see that there's any tension there. I think that obviously there's always going to be risks of pandemics that may have a big impact in the very near for a very short period of time on the average lifespan. But it doesn't really affect the progress that's being made in developing therapies against the problems that have plagued us for a long, long time. Similarly in terms of population, people often oversimplify this question. People say, "Oh dear, we've got too many people." But honestly, what do we mean by that? What we actually mean is we have too much pollution. Because it's not as if there's any difficulty in terms of finding enough space for everybody. As of now, there's considerably more than 8 billion acres of land on the world, even if you don't look at the places that are not much fun to live. So it's like there's plenty of space. It's just that we are making too much greenhouse gases and stuff like that. And of course,
But
we're working.
honestly, one person controls most of it, right? From a population standpoint.
Well, kind of. Not really. I mean, the point is, we're developing the technologies to fix this, right? Whether it's carbon capture or whether it's artificial meat, so to say, in agriculture, or whether it's bacteria that eat plastics, or cheap desalination. These things are all coming.
Right. Can I just reframe it? When I talked about it from a relevance, I do understand that efforts of LEV is obviously needed because you're talking about defeating diseases, not the death per se. So, which is necessary for all of it. But the question was more from a point of 8 billion is obviously the majority of them don't live in a space where they can actually afford a lot of these treatments. So, how do you see the relevance? I think it's the play of a rich and powerful.
So this is another profound misconception that so many people have, and honestly, I do get somewhat frustrated sometimes because I've been explaining why this is a misconception for like 20 years on stage and on camera every other day in, day out. So the thing is that these therapies, obviously, they don't yet exist, and the result of the lack of those therapies is that we're spending the most insane amount of money keeping sick people alive at an old age. Now, of course, the proportion of the medical budget of a country is differs from different countries, and it's the wealthiest countries, the ones in the West and the industrialized world, that have the highest proportion spent on the health problems of the elderly. But in just the same way that life expectancy of absolutely every country in the world is now over 50, similarly the expenditure, even for, certainly for a country like India, is in terms of medical budget, is mostly on the health problems of late life, which means that when these therapies do come along, which I'm hoping won't be very long now, it will be, forget about the humanitarian imperative, forget about even the electoral imperative, right? Because, I mean, some countries do strange things at elections sometimes. But just look at the straightforward mercenary economic imperative. These therapies are going to pay for themselves many, many times over really quickly at the level of the country, right? For pretty much every country in the world. Even if those therapies are initially quite expensive to deliver, that will be easily outweighed by the savings that will occur through stopping people from getting sick and having people able to continue contributing wealth to society rather than just consuming wealth. So it will be in the absolute clear vested interest, economic interest of any government to ensure that anybody who's old enough to need these treatments is able to get them, whether or not they can pay for them themselves. And of course, different countries will have different mechanisms. There's countries like the USA that have a healthcare system that's mostly paid for by insurance, by private insurance, whereas other countries will have a single payer system, but that doesn't matter at all. Whatever the mechanism is, the economic argument is completely solid. And this has been made clear.
So you say it trickles down eventually.
forget about the trickling. It's not going to be trickled down the way it's for
Oh, you
iPhone.
say it
It'll be it'll be
it
immediate.
gets sprayed down to everyone. It just won't trickle
And the
down.
reason, and the reason this will happen is because people will see it coming. Most technologies, when they come along, no one expected them, right? Like, no one expected the iPhone until Steve Jobs got up and presented it at some conference. But people are watching these therapies on their way to coming into existence. So governments will be ready way before, years before these therapies actually occur, and they will do the relevant, front loading of investment into infrastructure and medical personnel and so on that will be required to do what I just said they will want to do for economic reasons.
Well, true, but see, so far, the humanity has not lived that way, right? Like you said, there is certainly 8 billion acres. If it was up to all of us, that everybody would be as wealthy, at least from a point of land holding.
It's
But
cost
it's the human greed that tries to hold it and not share it and not make it available to everyone, right?
It's all
So,
about cost benefit. I mean, at the end of the day, wealthy people, live, they live within the law, same as poor people. They pay taxes, same as poor people. Yes, they are, privileged, but the amount of inequality in a given country is only as great as what the general population of that country are willing to tolerate, right? And different
absolutely.
countries have different things. But so, nobody cares that only wealthy people are able to have yachts. But everybody cares if there's any restriction on availability of clean drinking water, right? So it's like that. It's like, how much do you care? How much of a human right does society think it is to
Oh,
have something?
ironically, you mentioned clean drinking water. I was looking at some data, something to support a different argument of mine, and I found out that in India we still have people dying out of waterborne diseases, significant numbers. I'll not, but then I thought, let me just look up USA, and funnily, I found there is significant deaths happening out of US also for uh, the same reasons. So, so as
Right.
much as we think,
No, 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 I hear you. I know that still we have some way to go to give truly universal access to these basic things. But that's a very different question from something being only
yeah,
a small minority of people having the thing, right?
no, but what you're trying to address, I mean, if you address some of these small things, it becomes much easier to address the health issue because we are
I
keeping alive the basic problems.
I would like to agree with you, but I don't really agree with you. I think that the things that look small only persist because the fundamental problem is not small, it's societal, and societal problems are really difficult to
So,
solve. When a problem is mostly a technical problem, a technological problem, it's actually a lot easier.
totally. So that takes me to this question. So, what does longevity mean to you in terms of one, numbers, in terms of two, abilities, and then socially, financially, and lastly, spiritually? Does that fit into your sense of LEV?
I use the word longevity really only because everybody else does. As I said, I really think about health, and longevity is simply a side effect of health. So I only talk about longevity because it's the usual word to use. Um, as such, well, I've already said that I think it's likely that people will live a very, very great deal longer, even people who are alive today, but that's only a probability. I don't know how soon that's going to happen. I think we have a 50-50 chance of reaching longevity escape velocity within the next 12 to 15 years from now. But I think we've got maybe a 10% chance of not getting there for 100 years if we hit unforeseen obstacles. So,
So, what
um,
does that in numbers mean? Longevity, escape velocity, in terms of what would be that optimum number, or the
yeah.
escape
So
velocity number, not the
remember,
optimum.
right. So remember, longevity escape velocity is a rate of progress by the scientists who are developing these therapies. So somebody else, a friend of mine, coined the term the Methuselarity by
Sorry,
in
come
a
again.
the Methuselarity. It was by analogy with the singularity. And the idea was basically this is the point at which we reach longevity escape velocity. And the reason it makes sense to think about it that way is because once we do reach longevity escape velocity, it's vanishingly unlikely that we will ever go so slowly that we are no longer going at longevity escape velocity. So there'll be a single point where that happens. And that's the point that I think is 12 to 15 years away with 50% probability. But what that means for people, for individuals, is that we'll have this very sharp cusp. And people have said this a lot. Ray Kurzweil said it in terms of living long enough to live forever, and other people have talked about the last generation to die or the first immortal generation or whatever. All of these are colloquial ways of saying the same thing, saying that we'll have a very sharp cusp between people who live only slightly longer than they're living today and people who are living basically as long as they can stay out of the way of asteroids and trucks.
Right. So the the part of the question, right, in terms of what abilities do you demand that to get to this point? How do you see that? I mean, of course, today AI is amplified every other effort.
So AI is definitely having a huge impact in medical research in general, not just in longevity research.
Right.
And most of the most important impacts are, in fact, across the board. So AlphaFold is a great example. This program that figures out the three-dimensional shape of proteins by looking at their amino acid sequence. That will continue to be true. But at the end of the day, we also need huge amounts of bench work, of actual, boring, wet stuff. People who've been trained to work pipettes and gels and stuff like that. And that's very much going on right now. So there's no real single thing that I would point to. Biology is insanely complicated. We have to develop a lot of different medicines in order to make this work.
I was trying to lead this towards, from a point of abilities, would be towards what kind of work will people have to be put in, what kind of resource capabilities they'll have to be developed, even from a point of education, right? If we have to get to it.
Okay, so you mean to get to longevity escape velocity? That already exists. We have the right people with the right skills in computer science and also in bench work. We need more of them, and largely that means better funding for the work. At the moment, because there is still such a desperation to put aging out of one's mind, it is still very difficult to get money in the door to do all the relevant work. I should elaborate on that a little bit. What certainly has happened over the past few years is an enormous influx of dollars, of money, into the field overall. However, that influx has been very, very unevenly distributed. It has gone overwhelmingly to particular, fashionable or low-hanging areas that are amenable to perhaps, making profit fairly soon. Anyone who wants to make money wants to make it tomorrow, right? So that means that this is at the expense of areas that are just as important but are more difficult and are still at that kind of pre-investable stage. And the work that we're doing at LEV Foundation very much falls under that category. So at the moment, most of our budget goes on extremely expensive and audacious mouse lifespan experiments, trying to combine various different treatments in the same mice at the same time to keep them healthy and alive for maybe a year longer than normal, which is a lot in mouse lifespan terms. We're struggling to get the money to do this work because it's not patentable. We're essentially using things that already exist. It's desperately, desperately important. Without this, we won't know what to do next.
True. In the same context, right? One is that you said that there are biologists and there are computer scientists, and we just need more of them. But do you also see that education has to start focusing on some streams from a point of building capacity towards this? See, one is today, of course, it's reference to cross-functional collaborative efforts and such. But is there some area where you think education should also go towards so that it becomes much easy and where faster for them to be able to contribute here?
Yes. Way back near the beginning of Sense Research Foundation, so a decade or more ago, we started an education initiative where we would take undergraduates during the summer for 2 or 3 months and train them up to do lab work and also to understand a lot about the field, so that they would be typically very top of the range undergrads, and they would be wondering what they might do for their doctoral work and so on. And so we would do this in order to help them to choose to go into longevity research. And we extended that after that to give people an entire year immediately after their undergraduate degree. And that's very valuable. It's still happening on a significant scale, and the more of that, the better. But on top of that, it's very valuable to take people who already have the formal skills that are required, but who don't know how to use them so well. In other words, for example, people with entrepreneurial track records, or with a track record in journalism or in advocacy. People write to me all the time because, of course, I've been around a long time and I'm the top Google hit. People write to me all the time and say, "Hello, I'm really keen on getting into the longevity movement. I don't know how I can help." And historically, I have done my best to connect such people with the right other people they might work with and so on. But there's only so much that one person can do in that regard. So one thing I did last year was to seed fund a new initiative called Less Death. Again, it should be called Less Aging, but it's called Less Death. It's all to do exactly what I just said. They hold retreats, 3 or 4 times a year, where they bring maybe 50 people together, give them a few, tutorials and so on, but mainly community build. And of course, I run conferences every year as well. So the next one's coming up on August the 17th to 20th in Dublin in Ireland. And these conferences are, again, exactly for this. There's, of course, fantastic speakers, the absolute top people in the field, absolutely everybody who's anybody. But there's a huge emphasis also on the recreational component of the conference so that people can actually, get involved in a way that they might not have known how to do before. That's the main thing. It's not so much the formal education that's missing, it's the networking.
Wonderful. Are there chapters of this across the globe, or is there an intent to do that?
There are kind of, yes. I mean, it's too fragmented still. It needs to be better. But so Less Death certainly runs its retreats globally. As I say, I run my conference in Ireland, even though I'm based in California. There are other conferences around the world. Honestly, Asia, especially the Far East, but I would have to say I include India here, is lagging. It needs to catch up a bit in terms
How
of...
do we do that? You could probably give a shout out through this.
How would it? Well, I mean, the thing is, it comes from the ground up. It comes from the grassroots. In some countries, I think the ones I would put at the top of the list are actually Canada and Russia. There is a huge grassroots enthusiasm for this movement. And, people get stuff done because they come together, organically without really even being encouraged or guided. But I mean, you put your finger on it in the first part of the talk of our talk that it's not really a priority in most people's minds, in hardly anyone's minds really, in India, and the Far East. I would say it's perhaps even worse. I think the fundamental thing in the Far East is that they have. Let me be kind of undiplomatic about it. They have the wrong kind of respect for the elderly. They view the elderly as very important to keep them integrated in society and everything like that. And so the elderly are well treated, but that makes it even harder for people from Japan or such countries than it is in the West to view aging as a medical problem. And you can measure this in certain, I mean, here's an obvious way to measure it. I've probably given 700 or 800 talks in the past 20 years all over the world, right? I've never once been invited to give a talk in Japan.
Have you come to India?
Yes, but again, only maybe 3 or 4 times. And that's despite the fact that I'm married to someone from Bangalore.
Wow. Okay. So we should probably get you to Bangalore to do
Okay.
this. Uh, well, see, I think if I may, the East does respect the elders,
Yeah.
but they do fear the disease part of it. They would really like to challenge it as defeat the disease, but their outlook to death or the life expectancy is very different in the sense that that is an element of nature that I cannot determine when I die, or I cannot determine how long I will live. Though, astrology is a common thing in the sense people still like to know how long I will live, but not to extend it, but to be aware. So that is the approach. But everybody would like to live healthy. So that is the part which is not getting communicated. See, the why transhumanist movement is not getting forward here. People talk about defeating death or live for 1,000 years. I mean, like, why should I live for so long?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah, it's a kind of making people make their peace with with death, and as a result, they make their peace with aging, but they don't really. As you
No,
said,
they don't make peace
they
with the
want.
aging. They make peace with death. See, that is the
That's
part.
right.
But if you can communicate to the aging as a problem, everybody associate with the problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I use the word side effect so much, right? Over and over again, I say, listen, if you don't stay healthy, you will die fairly soon. But if you do stay healthy, you probably won't die fairly soon. Get over it. These two things are inextricably intertwined.
I think the problem in the East broadly is the connection to the death aspect of it. If you just leave and say healthy living for long, I think people connect here because nobody likes to be sick.
Yeah.
And age and associated illness is a problem for everybody. They always complain about it, but not in the way it is coming through from the transhumanism or longevity sense of point of defeating death or extending life, but living an extended healthy life to however long you can.
Yeah, so you can hear the difference of emphasis, right? I don't talk about death or postponing
Correct.
death for the sake of postponing death. I talk about postponing
Right.
death as a side effect of postponing aging.
Absolutely. I think this is a voice that is missing, but I think perhaps you're not connected or communicated. This communication of yours has not come through as effectively in the East for you to find more people coming
Well,
onto it, I think.
I assure you, it hasn't come through that effectively in the West either, despite the fact that I've been saying it day in, day out for the past 15 or 20 years. Just
Oh,
the other
but you
day,
are one of the biggest voices in this space in the West.
just the other
Clearly.
day, I was reminded of an interview that I gave on stage in Switzerland in, I think, 2013, maybe 14, so nearly a decade ago. And I was saying the exact same things I'm saying to you today. It's, and I still have to do it in the West as well as in the East. It's just people don't want to be rational about aging because that would require them to stop putting it out of their minds, and it would require them to get kind of emotionally invested in it, and they don't want to do that. They'd prefer to be illogical.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's something very amazing about human beings. So, part of the same question I had earlier in terms of uh, you did speak about the economics of it, but from a sense of spirituality, how do you connect LEV in this spiritual lens?
So yeah, I'm not really a spiritual person. I'm a practical, pragmatic, I guess materialistic kind of person. I just think about the things in my immediate life that I enjoy. And as such, I don't really have opinions about how people should relate the progress of any technology, including this technology, to their spirituality. It's just like it's not part of my psyche, so I don't have an opinion.
Oh, it's perfectly fine for you to uh, think the way what is you think is good for you. But I was only trying to connect it from a point of there is a whole lot of East who are in the sense think spiritual, but they completely connect with the point of aging brings a lot of suffering and all the side effects of it. and they would really like to, they would really appreciate what you're thinking, irrespective of your thought or the thought process of being materialistic or a person who lives in the moment. I mean, there are rationalists. I mean, however, you associate with it. I don't think that would bother somebody who identifies themselves to be spiritual. But I was only trying to say that how would you connect with this, because they associate with this as much.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know. This is kind of what I meant when I said I don't have an opinion. I really think like everybody's spirituality is very personal, right? They
Hmm.
think about their own connection to the universe in their own particular way, and I think in order to discuss any technology, certainly any technology that would have a dramatic impact on one's place in the universe, like how long one lives and so on. To discuss anything like that with someone spiritual, one has to understand their spirituality. And so I haven't even taken the first step in that direction.
Well, how would you measure your efforts with LEV? One is, of course, you did say that in 12 to 15 years is where you see that we get to that point. But obviously, you must be having some sense of measure to say that, okay, we are progressing in that direction.
Right, certainly. And that can be measured by many metrics, actually. One of them is just looking at the scientific progress that's been made, the breakthroughs that have been made over the past decade or two. And if I think, if I try to put myself back in where I was 20 years ago when I was getting going, and what I thought was likely to happen or unlikely to happen, honestly, I think things have gone about as at the same speed or perhaps a little faster than I would have expected. So, that's good. And of course, it means that. And one thing that I probably ought to also emphasize is that the fundamental way of looking at aging, the paradigm that I introduced in 2000, has very much stood the test of time. It's something that has not needed any major, rethinks, which is very good news because it means that that's the kind of circumstantial evidence that says that it's probably going to carry on standing the test of time and not having to be abandoned and replaced, which is really the basis for any kind of optimism with regard to the timeframes for actually getting all the way to LEV.
So, do you think that you made some mistakes? I guess all of us do make mistakes, but do you think there have been some significant mistakes you did, and how do you see what are your learnings, and how do you, from a context of how do you see those learnings of your mistakes helping you in the future in this effort?
Yeah, very good question. Everybody does make mistakes, you're quite right. And, honestly, it's the thing that scares me the most because, arguably I'm the single person making the most difference in this crusade, in terms of the ideas I'm putting forward and the exposure that I have in the wider world. And so any mistakes that I make cost lives, right? And so I think about this a lot. But I honestly, I'm very proud that to say that at the moment, I really don't think I can look back and say that I've made any major mistakes. There's some things that I could argue that I would have done differently if I'd known things I didn't know. But anyone that doesn't really count as a mistake in my book. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I definitely get scared of it. Yeah.
Oh well, another thing about people is that we invariably get into some kind of a loop. We keep doing things, and when we think we are trying to do something differently, we tend to do it differently, but invariably at the core of it, it would be the same thing. So we end up doing same things and getting to the same outcome without, sometimes you have to do something really different if you want to change the code, but we always think we are doing something different, but the core of it seems to be the same thing. That how do you break out of that loop? Is there
Yeah,
some conscious way of it?
I do have a pretty good solution to that one, I think. And it kind of harkens back to the situation I was in when I switched fields. And when I was able to make, significant new contributions that really other people should have made, but they didn't because, basically they were thinking they were thinking originally, but actually they were in the kind of loop that you're describing. So for me, the solution is not to try to have control, to essentially empower other people in the
How do
community.
you explain that? Not to have control?
Not to have control, that's right. So that's what I'm trying. So the way I would elaborate is to say what I do rather than trying to orchestrate the community that I've built, right, to direct everybody and to, have a big organization and employ lots of people. Instead, what I try to do is to stick to what I know I do well, which is just basically making a nuisance of myself and, being the professional heretic and poking the people who are, in my view, overly wedded to establishment thinking. But other than that, I empower other people to do stuff. I direct funding to newcomers or new organizations. I mentioned Less Death a little while ago. It's a perfectly good example of this. I constantly, I'm very much a man of the people kind of celebrity in my field, in the sense that I'm always accessible. Everyone's got my email address. I only have one email address. Things like that. And I find that is a great antidote to the problem you're describing. It means that even to the extent that I myself might get into loops, it doesn't actually do any harm because other people are getting stuff done anyway with their own loops.
All, all right. I mean, I'm just trying to get my head around if we can simplify that. Is that about, so when you're trying to do something, just don't try to predetermine the outcome, do it. And even if somebody else is trying to do that, help them out and don't try to own and control how that
Yeah.
outcome is. That what you're
Yes, it is. It
trying to?
is. I and part of this is just what a big part of being a good scientist is knowing that you could always be wrong about things. So that applies not only to how one designs one's experiments, how one chooses what experiments to do, and so on. It also applies to one's attitude to other people's work. There are definitely, there's definitely work being funded now that I think is unlikely to come to fruition. But it's only when I'm sure not going to come to fruition that I try to persuade the people to do other things. If I think it's got some chance, and if the people in question are, highly credentialed and know what they're doing, then, even if I think they're wrong, if I'm not sure they're wrong, then I'd prefer to have the diversity out there so that somebody will be right as soon as possible.
Well, uh, how will you stop yourself from the point and saying that, okay, maybe what I was trying to do is wrong, but what he's trying to do is right? How do you bring that rationality in? I mean, it's something very difficult, right? For
Well, in science, it's not so difficult as it is perhaps in other walks of life, because at the end of the day, experiments get done and they get results, and sometimes the results are surprising, and sometimes the results are so surprising that the experiment has to be reproduced and repeated by some other lab. But one way or another, this is how progress gets made. This is how we get to better understanding of things by doing experiments and having results that were not the ones we expected to get.
oh, well, uh, you said you are so much of a pragmatic rationalist, but your conversation is as much of a spiritual spiritualist. So, okay, so
I'm an introspective pragmatist or something.
right. Well, on a probably in an offline conversation, I can connect that with so much of the spiritual talk that I also listen to, and it connects so much with that. So, which is funny that one may think it is very contradicting, but it doesn't seem so contradicting. So, you did say that you are perhaps the one who's contributing most. But do you want to take think of have you identified people who are really contributing to this longevity space otherwise anywhere globally?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's lots and lots of us now. Well, I mean, okay, there's not lots. As in any field, there's always half a dozen people at the top, who are making the most difference.
Right.
And, if I single myself out, it's only really in the sense that I call myself the professional heretic. I'm the one who's got myself into this curious position of being able to make a nuisance of myself and say things that piss other people off, and not really suffer much consequence. Whereas most people are more, quote, in the system than I am. But of course, there's masses of people who are doing great things in the field. In the contrast that I just described, the person I often use to illustrate this is David Sinclair. So David's obviously a very prominent gerontologist. He and I have been great friends for 20 years. And he's every bit as courageous as me. But the thing is, it took him more than a decade longer than me to write a general audience book that said, we don't need to age. We can fix this. So you may ask, why did it take him more than a decade longer? And the fundamental answer was because he's a professor at Harvard, which is has its advantages, but it's also something that, has its disadvantages. He probably wouldn't have continued to be a professor at Harvard if he'd put his book out the same year I did, back in 2007. He'd probably have been fired. Whereas now he can get away with it.
And yeah, David Sinclair is clearly one of the big names in that. And anybody else you can, outside
sure.
of US?
Absolutely. So, one great example, since we were talking about Asia earlier, is Brian Kennedy, another great friend of mine. He runs something called the Center for Healthy Aging in Singapore. And he is American originally. He used to run the Buck Institute, which is the biggest independent aging research institute in the US. But yes, he's very much, Singapore, of course, they often try to be in the lead among Asian countries with regard to any technological area. And so they brought him in, and he's, moving that forward, not as fast as I would have hoped, but as fast as he can. There's a few people in Europe as well, but there's not nearly enough. There really needs to be a lot more investment by governments and sovereign wealth funds and so on, people who are not in a hurry to make money back, and therefore who will do the whole job rather than just the low-hanging fruit.
Right. So, given that, how do you see LEV and your efforts doing and particularly evolving, in US and globally?
So, I honestly don't want to predict very far in advance here, because things are moving so fast now. For example, we're doing a huge, very audacious mouse lifespan experiment right now. We've got 1,000 mice that we are giving combinations of 4 different treatments. And a lot of what we're going to be doing like 3 years from now depends on how that experiment ends, how successful it is. What we're going to be doing 1 year from now, so long as we bring the money in, is another experiment of this same nature in parallel, using different combinations of different interventions. And we also want to do, other projects working on specific types of damage, developing ways to repair that damage. But and also we do a whole bunch of stuff in the advocacy space as well. But even 3 years from now, honestly, it's too far away to know, because things are moving fast these days.
So true. Are there any efforts of yours which has gone beyond US in terms of collaborative effort, research, or even that funding as the slow death?
Sure, not only in Europe, though, Western Europe. Okay. We have funded over the years a number of groups in the UK and Germany and France and I think and Spain, but nothing in Asia yet.
And but when you say you're funding, but do you also attract support from Europe apart from doing the research efforts?
Sure. Germany, again, is probably the best example. There's a guy named Michael Graeber who was one of the real pioneers in Germany in the early days of the internet in the early 90s. And he created a few of the most successful German websites and made a huge amount of money out of that. And he decided to put it all into longevity once he heard about what I was doing. So starting in 2016, he started giving Sense Research Foundation, the thing I ran back then, very respectable amount of donations, and he also put a bunch of money in as investments into startup companies. So yeah, that's a very important player. There's another group in Germany called Apollo Ventures, which again funds small companies typically, and more companies in Europe are getting involved. There's a what they call themselves a company builder called Maximon, based in Switzerland, which is doing again, helping companies to get up and running. Various venture funds and big pharma companies like Roche and Pfizer, and which are mostly based in Europe as well. So yes, I mean this is the kind of thing that I expect will gravitate, will spread more globally pretty soon now, and the sooner it moves into the Far East, the better.
Oh, well, I'm associated with an incubation center inside the Indian Institute of Science, IISc, if you're familiar with. IISc is one of the premier research institutions in India. And this has been there for about few years now, the incubation facility, which is primarily focused at assistive technologies and aging. So there are some interesting work happening there. Nothing is come to something globally, but this effort is on primarily encouraging entrepreneurs to work on these areas. So there are such
That's
efforts
good.
happening for quite some time, but maybe nothing hit big, or nothing as big from a point of trying to talk about extending longevity or longevity per se. But yeah, I'm trying to identify people like that out here as well. So so what is changing in this space? You've been one of the longest uh, person who stayed on in this. So, and obviously, and for all the right reasons, you are pretty much the face as well. So, what is changing now? As things have started happening so fast, uh, what's
Well,
changing in this?
well, I've mentioned a few things already. One thing I haven't mentioned yet that's worth mentioning in answer to that is the intersection of the longevity community with the cryptocurrency community. So turns
How intersection? How's that?
turns out it's a huge intersection. And if you think about it, it's not so surprising because the crypto community, first of all, they are geeks. They're engineers. They think like engineers, so they understand the concept of aging as an engineering problem. And the idea of preventative maintenance and damage repair is kind of thinking of the body as a machine is something that comes naturally to people who have an engineering background. Second thing is that they are radicals. They're comfortable with doing things that are unusual and unconventional. The whole of crypto is obviously pretty unconventional, right? So that helps. And the third thing is that really helps is that so many of them are very young, like in their 20s. That helped hugely because, young adults are, I don't know, a higher proportion of them have still got, no, they haven't been ground down by failure. They still have the inclination to aim high and, reach for the sky. And so we've got a lot of crypto support now. And in particular, some of the big hitters, some of the really wealthy people in the crypto community have been supporting the longevity movement. There's a guy named Richard Hart who's been a fan of mine for quite a while, but who a couple of years ago decided to put his money where his mouth is. And in fact, rather than put his own money, he decided to mobilize the community of people who own the currency that he created, a currency called Hex. And the result was, a very substantial amount of money was donated to the longevity movement. And so, this is just one example. There's been plenty of other examples now. So yeah, I'm not surprised that you were surprised when I mentioned it, but when you think about it, it's not so surprising.
Yes, and well, incidentally, I'm in blockchain as well. But, yeah, that your explanation makes it easy to connect. But of course, the last part where the people who have made wealth out of crypto and backing this, and that seems a lot more logical from the context as well. Right. So uh, now, how do you foresee? I mean, is there a point you interact with government agencies? Uh, and how do you see government agencies responding to it? And what do you see? Where do you see that their participation will really amplify this whole?
Yeah, so that's really getting going now. That's something that's probably going to have a real sea change very soon. So remember I was saying earlier on about how the economic imperative to ensure that these therapies are made available to everybody as soon as they're available at all. That's a very solid, straightforward cast iron argument. Now, that argument has been communicated to governments for decades, and it has fallen on absolutely deaf ears. But that's not because the governments don't understand the logic. It's because governments don't agree with the premise that a relatively modest amount of investment in longevity research will actually deliver a postponement of the health problems of late life. And of course, as time goes on and science progresses, it becomes more and more difficult not to believe that that's what's going to happen if you put the investment in. So things are really changing there. But perhaps the biggest thing in terms of government involvement is regulation, the approval of drugs. At the end of the day, the people who write the big checks to get drugs developed and through the clinical trials process, those people want their money back. They want to make profits. And they know that they can't do that unless the drugs in question are approved by the regulatory authorities like the Food and Drug Administration in the US, and thereby, are passed on and given to patients, reimbursement happening. And so changes are already happening there. The FDA have essentially figured out a way to recognize that aging is a medical problem, which was not true even 5 or 8 years ago. Similarly, the World Health Organization has built aging into the International Classification of Disease now, which is very, very important. But perhaps what's even more important is to liberalize the regulatory regimes. So there is, of course, a big movement now called the biohacking movement of people, self-administering things that have not yet been approved or whatever. And people are getting more and more intelligent about how to do that, not just how to get the right information to make sure they do it as safely as possible, but also to gather good information that they can report and share with each other and with the world. So we're getting into a position now where more and more data is coming available, and also people are developing their own situations in terms of regulation. People are creating special economic zones in countries like Honduras that are, where they make their own rules about what's approved and what isn't. And even in the more conservative countries like the US, there are changes happening. So there was legislation passed a few years ago called the Right to Try legislation in the US. And what that was all about was it basically said, if you're terminally ill, if you have, exhausted all options, you can take what you like, whether or not it's
The
approved.
euthanasia you're referring to.
No, I'm talking about to try to save your life, not to kill yourself.
Oh, okay.
You can access unapproved therapies if you've tried everything that was approved. That was passed some years ago, a few years ago now. Very recently, one state in the US, Montana, passed a parallel piece of legislation which says that even if you're not terminally ill, whoever you are, even if you're perfectly healthy and haven't even been diagnosed with anything, you can access therapies that have been through the first stage, what's called phase 1 of clinical trials, even if they have not been through phases 2 and 3 and gone through FDA approval. So that's huge. Masses and masses of therapies get to phase 1 and then they're not profitable or whatever. So this can make a real difference, and there's now a big push to get that legislation enacted in other states in the US and of course worldwide. So yeah, this is the kind of thing where we need to get involved. Now, I myself, I'm definitely not a politician, and so I'm probably not the right person to be sat in front of people in the corridors of power in any country, not even in the US or the UK. But I know people who are. So another group that we fund is called the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. It's a lobbying group in the US. It was actually the group that oversaw the thing in Montana that I just mentioned.
Uh, the question also was, right now India is hosting G20.
Uh-huh.
So there is a lot of conversation happening across every area, right? Even on entrepreneurship, it's happening, and technology, health, everything. But I don't, I don't recall seeing longevity even talked about it. So maybe there is a need to get into these kind of forums to send a voice. I'll just see if there is a way I can get some connect to plug you in there
Sure,
from a
yes.
point of bringing in this conversation. I think what is necessary in these forums is that this conversation should be brought in first.
It's starting to happen, but you're absolutely right. It's at the very, very baby steps at this point. So last October, I spoke at a conference in Saudi Arabia called the Future Investments Initiative, which is basically a government and industry leaders organization, a bit like Davos. In fact, they actually call it Davos in the desert. Um,
Uh,
and but basically, it was a waste of time. Except that they're having me back this year. Last year I was only asked to chair a panel. This year they're going to get me to give a keynote talk. So, that sounds like progress is being made. But in general, my view has always been that forums like this, no actual decisions get made at them. People go there and they announce things that have already been decided. And, you
no,
may,
but like you said, last 20 years you've been also trying to spread the word. See, these
yeah,
things have to get into the vocabulary, right? See, if something is discussed in G20, it gets through every media.
yeah,
So it will
yeah.
bring it to the front page.
Yeah, it just has to be presented to the media in the right way, though. I mean, I've been on the front of magazines since 2005. That's the easy
Probably
part.
technical magazines.
No,
How to
no.
get you to the Time magazine.
Yeah, I mean, like I wrote the reaction piece in Time magazine when they had the exclusive for the launch of Calico, which was 10 years
Okay.
ago. So I've been in all the places you'd expect. 60 Minutes, Barbara Walters, Stephen Colbert. It doesn't make any difference
It
because
doesn't.
no, because basically people treat it as entertainment because they don't want to get emotionally invested in it. And the media know that they want to sell papers, so they kind of almost promote that. They almost try to make the thing sound not quite real. Now that is changing, but it's changing at a glacially slow pace.
But see, G20 is getting the top 20 countries policymakers into the conversation. So those are the places perhaps it's more necessary to bring in the conversation.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, and the thing is that the problem is that the overwhelming majority of the G20 are democracies, which are run by people who have exactly one goal in life, which is to get re-elected, and therefore they don't fly in the face of public opinion. They follow
But
public opinion.
the people, aging people with issues, and health is a significant issue in the process. So I think it's a good reason for them to talk about it or start caring about it because they want to come back to power. They need to
It's
start addressing this.
It's certainly a good reason, but it doesn't seem to be top of the agenda. People always say, oh, it's the economy that matters the most, and so on. And so, fundamentally, it's the elderly don't complain enough. They do complain, but not enough, right? If they complained a little harder, then people were more sorry for them, the way they're sorry for youngsters who are sick, then we might have more rapid progress.
All right. Just a step back. I just want to dig a little more on biohackers. Uh, so do you see that community growing? I think biohackers have always been there, but only thing is that now the technology is amplifying the whole biohacking as a process.
Yeah,
So
you got it. And so it is growing. There are more biohackers now than there used to be, or at least there are more that are talking about what they're doing. And part of that is certainly because there's better technology.
yeah, and you have YouTube videos to instruct you how to insert a chip into you.
Yep.
So, do you openly support this effort, or is there a do you want to bring it into some sense of control? Because some of these things are dangerous as well, right? That experiment is going very wild in terms of trying to be able to consume more alcohol or different drugs and experience different things, extend those things. I mean, it's going everywhere.
So I am supportive of the biohacking movement. And the fundamental reason why is because I'm supportive of Right to Try, which I told you about a moment ago.
Right.
Because ultimately they're the same thing. I'm certainly not supportive of people doing things to themselves without proper guidance and without proper information. But there will always be people who are less risk averse, people who are, inherently early adopters by temperament, and therefore the priority is for society overall to learn as much as possible from what's going to happen anyway.
So it's okay, and risks are always part of anything new. So
Right.
right. I mean, honestly, I think that is what I kind of expected as well from. So, well, thank you so much. And is there a shout out you want to give to the entrepreneur and technologists who are our audience and listeners,
Certainly, yeah.
and how and why they should look at it? And is there something that they could connect with, even from that slow death,
I think you're talking about Less Death.
less
The,
death? Sorry,
yeah,
less death.
yeah.
Yeah,
So lessdeath.org, they can go to their website. You can look at what they do. But you can also, of course, go to my website, Mike Foundation's website, levf.org, and that will tell you all about the experiments that we're doing. We are a non-profit, a public charity based in the US. So anyone who pays taxes in the US can can get a tax rebate from donating to us. And obviously, the work that we do is pretty expensive, and it's pre-investable. It's not something that people are going to make money back from. But if you're the kind of person who wants to invest rather than donate, then I can certainly help you as well, because I am very deeply connected and embedded in the private sector aspect of this. I don't have any personal stakes in any of the companies that I consult for or advise, but I certainly know who's good and who isn't, and I can impart that wisdom to anyone who's interested. So absolutely, anyone can write to me. Aubrey@levf.org is my email address, and I'm happy to receive any emails anyone wants to send.
wonderful, Aubrey. Aubrey, great. Thank you so much for this, and all the listeners and audience. All the links are given below this podcast, and please follow him. Follow the kind of work they're doing, and believe me, he is very approachable and accessible, and he's one of the few people who actually responds almost immediately. So, which is amazing from a point of time difference. And probably I was also lucky, because I do think I was lucky in that sense. And so please do reach and stay following with Future Fast. And those of you who have not subscribed to it, subscribe now. And please do spread the word, reach, share this across, because I think this is one subject which is very important that we bring into our mainstream conversation, because we all have people who are aging, and the side effects are more and plenty, and it's getting more, and we need more effective solutions. And this is the kind of work Aubrey and his foundation is doing, and he's doing with various other organizations. So once again, follow this, and thank you, and enjoy the ride. Aubrey, thank you so much once again.
Thank you.